1/5 of the world's population and has declared the elimination of extreme poverty. We see this as a historic event that should be a subject of study and understanding for all peace-loving and progressive people. The upliftment of humanity anywhere is a cause for celebration everywhere. Our time has seen the dramatic rise of the Chinese state and economy. China has established links with much of the world in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even Europe through trade and economic programs like the Belt and Road Initiative. This has profoundly shaken Western dominance and control on the international scale. In contrast to China's rise, the foremost Western political power, the United States, is in a state of chaos and collapse. The US is seeing increasing poverty, rampant addiction, and a political system in disarray. The country which became the single hegemon and declared the end of history now stands on the crossroads of its own history. Further, the alliance that emerged to ensure Western military and economic dominance is falling apart. Many European nations are doubting their understanding, their unquestioning partnership with the US and their place in the European Union and NATO. The past 2 decades of continued war in Asia, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria, have all ended in defeat for the West. The domestic turmoil of the West coincides with their international retreat. This has opened up the possibility of the emergence of a new world order, one based on equal trade relations and peaceful coexistence. This is a profound historical moment, ripe with the possibility of change. For the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union and the consolidation of Western dominance, a different path has opened up for the world. At the center of this moment is the rise of China, an Asian country. We in India must regard the rise of our Asian neighbor not with suspicion and hostility, but with understanding and friendship. We are two great civilizations with ancient relations based on peace and mutual exchange. Buddhism is the greatest symbol of the profound link between these two civilizations. There is a long tradition of travelers and visitors who have gone between these two nations. Such names as Kashyap Matang, Dharmratna, Kumarji, Hyung Sang, Pahian are indicative of the arch of friendship between the two countries. Rabindranath Tagore revived these old memories of cultural exchange in his own visit to China and his interaction with Liang Qichao and Xu Zhimo. The natural progress of both India and China was interrupted when they were deindustrialized by the West, colonized or made into a semi-colony, and effectively ruled through a network of corrupt landlords and ruling elite. Both faced economic and cultural subjugation, domination and humiliation by Western powers. The opium that was flooded in China was being harvested by the British in plantations in India. So it's not surprising that the two people rose up almost simultaneously in the Taiping Revolution in China and the 1857 First War of Independence in India. Both these uprisings were brutally crushed, but ignited the hearts and minds of the Indian and Chinese people. The two struggles for independence were distinct but parallel struggles. They were exemplified by the two leaders who led them, Mao and Gandhi. These were two unique figures in world history, unpredicted, who changed its course. Their strategy and tactics were adapted to the different characteristics in their countries, but there was much that united them. They had a complete identification with the masses of people and the working out of the united front against imperialism. Both found their roots in seemingly the most backward part of society, the peasantry. In the villages, both Gandhi and Mao saw the revolutionary potential that could take the whole society to freedom. Through the terrain of the Long March, the CPC and Mao built trust with the Chinese peasant who had long been suppressed by dynastic rule and the demonic suction tube of Western imperialism. The CPC carried out literary and political education campaigns wherever they went. Gandhi traveled the country in the third-class coaches of the railway, and he studied man. Through experiences like his campaign in Champaran, he grew to know the peasant life intimately. The Communist Party of China and the Indian National Congress gained the trust of the masses through their cadres who were trained in the highest moral sacrifice and service. The Indian freedom struggle and Chinese revolution were both expressions of the striving of darker humanity to be free from Western economic and political domination and the factions of the native elite who lived off the suffering of the masses. These struggles led to the establishment of a people state in China and India. Though they chose different paths, both the Indian and Chinese revolutionaries were clear that it was in capturing the state and using it as an instrument of the upliftment of the people that the revolutionary process would be continued. Today, the state itself is under attack both from imperialist and neo-colonialist forces. The state has been won through great sacrifice and struggle of the people, and it is our only instrument of self-determination. The battle of ideas takes foremost place in such a situation as we struggle for a state of the whole people. This struggle needs peace and friendship between our two countries. This was enshrined in the Panchsheel Agreement, which stands still as a framework under which to conduct our relations. The 62 war was a big setback and retreat, but with China's changing leadership and changing role in the world, it is time that we put our past bitterness behind us. We in India must study the Chinese project and draw lessons for our own struggle to lift our people out of poverty. India and China, together with the rest of Asia and Africa, represent the future of mankind. 1/3 of the human population lives in these two nations, and both populations are primarily young. The weight of this must be understood in full. The potential of the youth in China has been developed and unleashed through poverty alleviation and education, and this must be the primary task for us in India. The young in these nations represent a huge reservoir of human potential that has the ability to transform and further science, art, and the human search for the truth. The potential of each individual is limitless and complex, and it is our moral imperative to be able to harness that for the upliftment of humanity. Further, it is not just the young, but the young basing themselves on the old and creatively building on it. It is the synthesis. It is this synthesis with the ancient that holds the key to the future. These old and mighty civilizations, if united, can guide the direction of humankind towards peace and progress with youthful vigor and energy. We congratulate our brothers in China on their historic accomplishments through the Communist Party of China in the past century. We call on all peace-loving Indians to join us in celebrating the centenary and in studying the experience of the Chinese struggle for freedom and our own freedom struggle. We call on the youth to take up the task of building peace in Asia and working towards a new Asia free from poverty and illiteracy. That is the mission statement in full. And I'd just like to say that we are organizing these events under a temporary committee for the friendship of Indian and Chinese people. And we have the support of the organizations I mentioned earlier. So the way today is going to be organized is I'm going to hand over the podium, I guess, to Emily, who will moderate the panel discussion, and then we'll have a short discussion. So over to you, Emily.
Good morning from America, but I know good evening for those in India and perhaps good afternoon for Professor Jacques. Today, I will be moderating the panel for today, and I'll begin with some remarks. Asia today is rising, and amidst the most serious crisis the West has seen, Asia's rise opens up the new and serious possibility of reconfiguring India and China's relationship, but also the whole world. It is this topic that we will discuss today. The collapse of the West may be best seen from within. Speaking from the United States, its collapse is severe, clear, and jarring. Currently, in the richest country in the world, an extraordinary amount of people still remain poor, homeless, and they struggle to find stable employment and a decent means of living. The poverty rate has not decreased significantly in years, but actually has increased. And the median household income has actually decreased. But the most stark sign of the West's collapse is the psychological and spiritual state of the people you see around you every single day. The masses of American people, especially the youth, are anxious, pessimistic, and depressed. Young people in particular feel they have no future. And in cities across the United States today, gun violence has increased by 30% over the past year. Rates of suicide, drug overdoses, and alcohol-related illnesses now termed deaths of despair, have increased so much that for the first time, the average life expectancy of a white American has lowered. I say this to say that American hegemony has not only prevented age-old neighbors from dictating their own relationships with each other, it has not only meddled in the rights of sovereign states to determine their own destinies, but it has also devastatingly denied its own people from having a voice in their government and living a life with dignity. In another moment of great crisis for the West, the aftermath of World War II, Song Qing-ling, wife of Sun Yat-sen and honorary chairwoman of the People's Republic of China, visited India and other Asian countries in 1955. With Europe in ruins after the war and unable to save its world system based on colonialism and slavery, darker peoples around the world struggled for and won independence. Amidst this crisis of the West, Song Qing-ling declared the possibility of a new dawn of peace, not just in Asia, but for humanity. With India and China 960 million people strong back then, of great importance. Quote, China and India, two great Asian powers, have by their actions as independent nations asserted the will of new Asia, rising out of bondage and backwardness. Since this will is the decisive factor in all Asian matters, since it must be taken into account in all world matters, what China and India think and do are bound to be of special importance, end quote. Now, as the West faces a greater crisis, we once again have a great opportunity to usher in a new world order. Just as Song Qing-ling said in 1955, India and China are significant still in determining a new dawn for Asia and the whole world, as the West falls and Asia rises. Quoting Nehru in his 2014 visit to India, Xi Jinping expressed the same. Quote, when India and China come together, it will be a big event for Asia and even the world. As the two largest countries in Asia, China and India have on our shoulders the historic responsibility and the mandate of the times to maintain peace and stability in Asia and achieve its prosperity and rejuvenation. China and India have a combined population of over 2.5 billion. If we speak with one voice, the whole world will listen. And if we join hands, the whole world will pay attention, end quote. To fulfill this new dawn, we must first understand imperialism's lasting role in Asia, in stoking war and dividing natural friends, but also in colonizing the minds of Asians to see your own people and your own neighbor as the West does. The West is no longer at the center and cannot be, even for its own people. Our question now is, when will the people of India and China be ready to determine our own futures unmediated by the West and usher in a new, more just world order? The West will no longer be able to exist the way it has, and very soon, the people in the West will actually soon need Asia and Africa to help them join humanity's march forward. I would now like to introduce our panel today called Brink of a New World System, Collapse of the West and Rise of Asia, well, Rise of China, which will be integral in understanding both the current crisis of the West and what it means for the path forward for India and China together. I'm very honored and pleased to introduce our two esteemed panelists. Martin Jacques is a renowned scholar and author who has written and spoken widely about the rise of China, the Communist Party of China, and the possibility of a new world order, including his seminal book, When China Rules the World. Jacques is also a visiting professor at Tsinghua University in Beijing and Fudan University in Shanghai. Sudheendra Kulkarni is a journalist and former advisor to the former Prime Minister of India, Atal Bihari Vajpayee. He is the founder and chairman of the Forum of a New South Asia, and he has written and spoken on China, the Communist Party of China, and India-China friendship. And so I would like to first now introduce Martin Jacques to begin our very exciting discussion today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emily, for those interesting words of introduction and your kind words about me. I hope I deserve them. I want to say first and foremost, it's a great honor for me to be invited to speak at this discussion. I can't think of a more important question, strategically speaking, than the future of the relationship between China and India. As you know, and as Emily's just explained, I've spent probably more than the last 20 years deeply immersed in trying to understand China and its rise and its likely impact on the world. But I also want to add a personal note when speaking about the relationship between India and China. More or less at the time when my interest just began to germinate on China, I met my wife to be, Harinder Varia, who was an Indian Malaysian, and tragically, when we were living in Hong Kong in 1999, she died from really racial discrimination in the hospital there as a result of essentially the handling of it by the Chinese staff there. Ravi, our son, who was 16 months at the time, of course, has got a good name, but not just in memory of Harry, but because we like the idea. So I have an intense intellectual and emotional interest in the relationship between China and India. I'm not so sure the relationship is where at all I'd like it to be, but I do share very strongly the conviction that it is very important to create a friendly and constructive relationship between the two countries, which will not be easy, as we know from recent history, but I think can be achieved. But first of all, I want to speak about China's rise, or rather, first of all, let me talk about the crisis in the West. I mean, I think that if you stand back a little bit from the sort of turbulence of current events, it's clear that things have really moved with remarkable speed over the last 2 decades. I mean, if you go to the back of the 90s, the United States was still riding very high. It was the era of globalization is synonymous with westernization. It was the unipolar era, the unipolar moment in terms of America's position in the global order. And yet over the last 20 years, things have changed with remarkable speed. If you look at the United States today, and also Europe for that matter, compared with what it was 20 years ago, then it's evident, not just diplomatically or politically, but also economically, that it's nowhere compared with what it was 20 years ago. Now, I think the two most important symbols of this transformation, not just symbols, but catalysts of this situation, expressions and catalysts of this situation, were firstly the 2008 financial crisis. We'll all remember that the mood in the West at that time was, China's rise is unsustainable because of its political system, and China at some point, sooner or later, is going to have a dirty, great, big economic crisis. That was, the idea of the twin crises, coming crises of China's were fundamental to most Western thinking at the time. But in fact, in 2008, we saw exactly the opposite. And the opposite was, the biggest financial crisis since 1931, not happening in China, but happening in the United States. And I think it's fair to say that it not only shook the confidence of the United States in its position in the world, but also it changed the view of the world towards the United States, that something was amiss and that it presaged more serious times to come in the position of the United States. Now, of course, the crisis was so important that the effects, the longer term ramifications, that ricocheted over the next period of 8 to 10 years. And with the election of Trump in 2016, it became clear that what had been an economic crisis in 2008, by this time, and we can find the same symptoms in Europe, had become a political crisis as well, with the election of a president who, in fact, was pretty hostile to the idea of the post-war order and United States' relationship to it. But it was not just that, was it? I mean, looking back on it, of course, and we're very aware of this now, is that it was also underlined something or magnified something which we were sort of aware of, but not nearly as aware of it as we became, which were the growing divisions in the American politics and a growing polarization. So now, if we look forwards from the point we're in now with Biden and so on, who can be sure who will win the next presidential election in America? What are the prospects for democracy in America? I mean, this question used to be asked on the left outside America, but now it was being asked in America itself, not just by, political rebels and deviants, as it were, but absolutely it was a mainstream question in American politics and American society. Could democracy survive? What was the future for the United States? Could the United States even, or this was a less asked question, survive in the form that it exists today? Even the idea of the unity of the United States. So this was an extraordinary change, and this, of course, underlines the weakening of America and the weakening of its influence in the world and the weakening of its long-standing hegemony ever since 1945. Now, I think that it's worthwhile in this context, just, looking forwards rather than backwards for a moment. The projection is that something like between 2030 and 2035, the Chinese economy is likely to account for 1/3 of global GDP measured by primary purchasing power, which would be roughly twice the size of the American economy. I mean, this is the kind of extraordinary historical change that we are presently living through. So I think it's fair to ask the question. I mean, the system, of course, has not collapsed yet. That would be wrong. It would be wrong to say that we're in that situation. I think it's fair to say that the existing global order, the American-dominated global order, is still in place, but it has been greatly weakened, and it no longer presides over the world in the way that it has. On the contrary, China is now more or less on a par with the United States economically in terms of GDP, PPP. It overtook the United States in 2014. China is a much bigger trader than the United States. Many more countries count China as its most important trading partner compared with the United States. In fact, relatively speaking, as a trading power, the United States is in decline. So the system, as you can see, is not just fraying, it's eroding. it's being undermined, not just in the political side or the diplomatic, but also in the economic field as well. So the future is going to look very different. And I think it's fair to say we already live, actually, having made those remarks, in what might be described or has been described as a post-American world. Now, a few words about China, which, though I haven't got so much time, so I'll have to give some illustrations. I mean, the transformation of China is absolutely a remarkable story. It's an unparalleled story. I mean, it is the most extraordinary economic transformation in modern economic history, and I think actually we can say ever over hundreds and thousands of years. We all know this, that for 35 years, the Chinese economy managed to grow at around 10% a year. It took over 800 million people out of poverty. As was said earlier on, this year it eradicated extreme poverty. And now, very interestingly, China is considering, or is not just considering, is in the early stages of major reforms in terms of inequality under the rubric of common prosperity. As we all know, Chinese inequality in China has grown very considerably in the period since 1978, and now it's clear that the Chinese government wants to address this problem as a matter of fairness and as a matter of actually social stability as well. Or take the pandemic. I mean, who would have thought in January, February 2020, during the crisis in Wuhan and the neighboring province, that we would be talking today about a death toll of around about 5,700 in China. Compare that with the United States. I can't remember what the latest figures are for the United States, but something like 750,000 or approaching 750,000 people. And this displayed the sheer strength of Chinese governance and also the resilience and solidarity and cohesion of Chinese society. Or take the question of vaccination. I don't know what the latest figures are. I think it's about 2.3 billion vaccines have been administered in China. And for every 2 vaccines in China, 1 vaccine has been sent to the developing world. Or take the question of Belt and Road, which I'll mention briefly. I mean, I think this is a most extraordinary initiative, which will, over time, this is a 50-year plus project after all, will reshape the Eurasian landmass and beyond, because it's not just addressing the question of Eurasia, and will take so many countries and so many peoples, help to take them out of poverty. Now, this brings me finally to the question of China and India. Now, I first of all want to very strongly endorse the sentiments and views expressed in your mission statement, which I think is really excellent. Of course, China and India share so much. I mean, if you wanted to take, historically speaking, 2 countries in the world and look at them historically, then I think the striking thing would be, or one of the striking things, is just how much they have in common. I mean, these are 2 very different, very rich civilizations with an extraordinarily long history. as you probably may know, I think I've argued in my book that China is a civilization state primarily and only secondarily a nation state. And I think that in a different way, you can make the same kind of argument out in terms of India. And both these countries see the world and see themselves as a result in a different way to the traditional nation state, Eurocentric idea of the nation state. And of course, although separated by a huge natural barrier, the Himalayas, I mean, there has been much interaction over a very long historical period between China and India, of which the most famous, I suppose, as the mission statement points out, is the arrival from India of Buddhism in China, which remains very present and influential to this day. Or speaking more contemporaneously, their post-war histories are also, very interestingly rather parallel. I mean, before we get to post-war, the 2 centuries beforehand, their experience of colonialism. I mean, although it was different, it was of exactly the same, as it were, ilk or genre. Both countries suffered grievously from colonialism. I would argue India more than China, but China suffered very badly as well. And Mao used to describe China, or describe China in his speech in 1949, the 1st of October, as a semi-colony. Both countries, India, I think, more than China, if I remember correctly from the statistics, actually barely experienced any growth for a very long historical period, and China, not much. Then after the Second World War, of course, which was a great moment for both China and India, India gains independence in 1947. China has the revolution in 1949 and brings to an end the forms of colonialism that it had suffered under, starting with the British, and then, of course, many other countries were involved in the colonial exploitation of China. And then, moving on, both countries have made, great progress since that time, since independence. Until 1978, China and India were more or less on a par. I mean, they were growing in that period, about 5% a year, something like that. Of course, it's 1978. China's leapt ahead since the reform period, and so it's much bigger than India. But maybe in the future, I think certainly in the future, India will begin, probably is beginning to close that gap. Now, of course, China and India are also very different. I mean, you can't go to India and go to China without being struck by the extraordinary differences. The cultures are very different. The relationship between state and society is very different. I mean, China's very much a state-centric society. India definitely isn't like that. But I don't think that these kind of factors should be a source or a reason for difference or division, but on the contrary, should be the reason for curiosity, for sharing, for mutual learning and respect. China, and I think this remark's already been made, India can learn so much from China, but also China has got important things, in my view, that it can learn from India. But of course, the period since independence, perhaps most of all, has been marred by the border conflict in 1962, which has remained a kind of a source of enmity, or in India's case, a sense of humiliation, perhaps is too strong a word, but resentment and disappointment since then. And somehow both countries need to find a way beyond this. I mean, I think this is a bigger problem for India than China, perhaps because of the result of the war in 1962. It doesn't loom large in the Chinese mind, but I know from my experiences visiting India and reading and talking to people that it looms very large in the Indian mind. And I think it's worth saying that China, I mean, after the revolution, China has a border with 14 countries. And I think bar one in a neighbor of you, I can't remember where it is now, but what, Bhutan, perhaps? I can't remember. Bar a very small territory like that, China has solved all its border conflicts, every one of them, usually to its own territorial disadvantage, except the one with India. So for all sorts of historical reasons, if this problem could be either in the first instance to some extent put to one side, not shelved, but put to one side, but I would also hope that essentially with better relations, the problem of the border will be solved. And this would be extraordinarily important. And we have to remember, and it's been said already, but it's always worth reminding ourselves, isn't it? That between them, China and India account for 38% of the world's population. I mean, this is an extraordinary phenomenon. And so if you're looking forwards, well, there's a very interesting map that's been done by Danny Quah, who's now Dean at the Lee Kuan School Union in Singapore, but was previously professor at the London School of Economics. And Danny's done with his econometric skills, he's plotted where the center of the global economy is. And of course, the center of the global economy in 1980 is in the Atlantic, a bit closer to Europe than the United States. And then he has it moving progressively so that now it's moved steadily eastwards and has moved now beyond the Gulf. And his projection is that in 2050, the center of the global economy will be on the Indian-Chinese border. What could be more suggestive of the future than this fact, and more suggestive of the importance of China and the China and Indian relationship? So I think my finishing remark would be, we need visionaries in China and India to create a new kind of relationship between the two countries, where instead of seeing negativity, they see the extraordinary positives of a relationship between two huge and great civilization states. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jacques, for a wonderful opening presentation today. Before I hand off the virtual podium to Sudheendra ji, I just want to say that for all of our audience members on Zoom or over live stream, if you have questions or comments you would like to make, you can leave them in the chat. Obviously Zoom chat for Zoom, and then Facebook Live, I'm keeping an eye on that. So feel free to leave questions for Professor Jacques or Sudheendra ji. Now I would like to introduce Sudheendra Kulkarni, who will go next and respond and add to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Nandita ji, Achishman Raju, Emily Dong, Professor Martin Jacques, and I don't see Ravi Bhuthalingam now, but I must mention that Ravi Bhuthalingam is one person who inspired me more than 10 years ago to make a serious study of China, and gave me many insights over the years. It's wonderful to be part of this discussion. And I want to thank the organizers for making a very thoughtful mission statement. That mission statement read so well, and it expressed all the concerns, as well as a certain commitment to promote India-China friendship and cooperation to transform the world. And Nandita ji made a very, very important statement that the uplift of any country, anywhere in the world, is a cause of celebration everywhere. And we are here to celebrate the accomplishments of China, our great civilizational neighbor, in its long civilizational journey of 5,000 years, but especially in the last 100 years since the formation of the Communist Party of China, and more particularly in the last 40 years since the reforms and opening up began. Let me begin by asking a question, which I asked myself. Is China our enemy or friend? Many people in India's political and media establishments, and also common Indians, expressing their views in the social media, view China as India's enemy. At the very outset, let me make my point of view clear, so that the viewers, not just the 20-odd people who are here, but others who might be watching, they should judge whatever I'm going to say from the perspective of my commitment to India-China friendship and cooperation. My view is inspired by the wise words of Mahatma Gandhi, who wrote a letter to a Chinese leader in 1942, and he said, I quote, "As a friend of China, I long for the day when a free India and a free China will cooperate together in friendship and brotherhood for their own good and for the good of Asia and the world." 1942. I think this should be certainly the guideline for all of us to promote friendship between India and China for their own good, for the good of Asia, and for the good of the world. Professor Juhan Lin, the renowned Chinese Indologist, described the neighborliness of India and China in the following words. This neighborliness is created in heaven and constructed on earth. I believe these words to be true. Juhan Lin, a great Sanskrit scholar, who among his numerous other works translated the Ramayana into Chinese, and he's regarded as a Gurudev in his country. Gurudev, great teacher. Now, what does our own Gurudev, India's Gurudev, say about India-China relationship? Friends, let me quote these words of Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore. And he said this in his lecture at the Imperial University of Tokyo in 1916. I quote, "The lamp of ancient Greece is extinct in the land where it was first lighted. The power of Rome lies dead and buried under the ruins of its vast empire. But the civilization whose basis is society and the spiritual ideal of man is still a living thing in China and in India. though it may look feeble and small, judged by the standard of the mechanical power of modern days, yet, like small seeds, it still contains life and will sprout and grow and spread its beneficent branches, producing flowers and fruits when its time comes and showers of grace descend upon it from heaven. And I believe the time has come. Nandita ji mentioned in a mission statement that we are living in a historical moment, a moment of great transformation. And this transformation can be achieved and accelerated only if India and China come together. I was very struck when I was watching some of the views of Professor Jacques. He describes China as a civilizational state. And today he also mentioned that India too is a civilizational state. We are not just normal Westphalian nation states. We are civilizational states and we are neighbors. We are neighbors, one can say, separated by the Himalayas, or if we look more deeply, joined by the Himalayas. You know, I have here with me a book, Himalaya Calling, The Origins of China and India, by Professor Tan Chung. Professor Tan Chung, great Indologist himself, is the son of Professor Tan Yun Shan. Professor Tan Yun Shan, who was the first director of the China Bhavan established at Vishwabharati University by Tagore. And it is these great sages, both ancient and modern, who remind us that our two civilizations have been created with a purpose, and that purpose must be realized. Friends, let me tell you something very, unbelievable. China and India are like two bodies with one soul. Now, who said this? Unbelievable though it may sound, this is what our own Prime Minister Narendra Modi told Chinese President Xi Jinping when they first met at the BRICS summit in Brazil in 2014. Xi Jinping himself revealed this in a speech at a function in Delhi when he came to India in September 2014. In that visit, and Emily Dong mentioned a speech that Xi Jinping delivered on that occasion. He said, when China and India come together, it will be a big event in Asia. So, unfortunately, our Prime Minister has taken this relationship in a different direction, and we'll come to that a little later. But the point I would want to make is China is not India's enemy. It is not a friend yet, but India and China can, and we should, become good friends and partners. Right now, the foremost need is for our two countries to become good neighbors who, despite some differences and disputes, must decide to continue mutually beneficial cooperation on a wide range of issues that matter to our two countries and to the world at large. Most importantly, our two countries must end the current state of hostility and tension, which is a responsibility of both. I had the good fortune of working with our former Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, in the Prime Minister's office. And Vajpayee ji used to say, we can change our friends, we cannot change our neighbors. We can change history, but we cannot change geography. It is an advice and it's also a warning. China, like Pakistan, is and will continue to be our neighbor. Neighbors cannot live in a quarrelsome relationship forever. There is no military solution that can end the boundary dispute between India and China. Of course, it cannot end the dispute even between India and Pakistan. China is a great power, but the situation is not like 1962. India is also strong, and that makes it even more imperative that we must find a peaceful solution to our boundary dispute. Unfortunately, the past year and a half have seen very unfortunate, tragic revival of tension and confrontation between our two countries at the line of actual control in eastern Ladakh. And we must find a way of ensuring that there is disengagement and de-escalation as soon as possible, so that even with the boundary dispute unresolved, we can somehow put it in the background as we did in the previous decades and expand cooperation. With cooperation will come more trust, and with more trust, a time will come when we can resolve even the boundary dispute itself to mutual satisfaction. Of course, both countries have to make certain compromises, and it is our responsibility, the leaders as well as the intelligentsia, to prepare the peoples of the two countries for the eventual compromise that we have to make for resolving this dispute. As Professor Jacques mentioned, China had certain boundary differences, disputes with 14 countries in its neighborhood, and it has resolved all of them except two: Bhutan, India. And even these can be resolved if there is trust. And for trust, we must have dialogue. And it is programs like this today that contribute in their own small measure to the dialogue, and dialogue leading to understanding, understanding leading to trust. Sadly, friends, the level of dialogue between our two countries is very low, very disappointing, especially among politicians. India's politicians, they just don't pay proper attention to China, even though China is our largest neighbor. They don't make an effort to understand our neighbor in all its dimensions. And to make matters worse, the Indian politicians, Indian public also is greatly influenced by the propaganda about China that is coming from the West. And anyone who is familiar with the way the Indian media looks at China would bear this out. Every time there is any reference to China, it is negative. Now, it is therefore an added responsibility of people like us to change the thinking of the Indian people, Indian politicians. Yesterday, just yesterday, friends, I was with a very senior leader of a very important political party in India. And I mentioned to him that we cannot live with this atmosphere of tension and suspicion between India and China. And people like you must take a certain stand. And for this, we must begin to know China better. So he said, what should we do? He said, why don't we in Mumbai create a center for promoting India-China understanding? So, and I mentioned to him that this should go beyond economic cooperation or strategic issues. It should go deep into the spiritual connectedness between our two countries. Now, he was not fully satisfied, but at least we came to the conclusion that yes, we should do this. I think that these are the efforts that need to be intensified in India for creating better understanding about China in India. Many people in India do not know or do not want to acknowledge that we simply cannot ignore China. It's not just our largest neighbor. Today, it's also the largest trading partner. In the last 1.5 years, there was a strident call for boycott of Chinese goods. But despite this boycott call by people who are associated with the ruling party, the fact is that last year, after the unfortunate incident in Galwan Valley, last year, in the first half of last year, the bilateral trade grew by 62%. It just goes to show that there is just no way we can ignore China. Of course, China is not a perfect country. There are many deficiencies, many shortcomings, which we should not gloss over. At the same time, friends, we should acknowledge that no country is perfect. No political system is perfect. And for this reason, when we talk of understanding between China and India, not only should we pay attention to what India can learn from China, but we should also tell our Chinese friends what China can learn from India. There is a certain asymmetry in the conversation today. A lot of people who are engaged in India-China dialogue, they talk about China's achievements. And of course, these must be highlighted, and I'm also going to highlight some of them. But at the same time, we must also, with great confidence and conviction, we should tell our Chinese friends what China needs to learn from India. Friends, the historical moment that Nandita ji mentioned, it also comes from a certain realization that in the 21st century, are two great nations that are simultaneously rising. Of course, China is rising faster and it's far ahead of India, but our two countries that are rising have a responsibility towards the world. In the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, early 20th centuries, countries in Western Europe chose the path of rivalry, which led to two horrific world wars. Should India and China emulate the destructive example in the 21st century? Or should we, as inheritors of the wisdom of the two great Asian civilizations that evolved on both sides of the Himalayas, with Buddhism as a common bond between us, should we not set a new example of constructive partnership for the good of our own good as well as the rest of the world? The answer is obvious. Therefore, it has become absolutely critical that we build India-China relations on proper lines, strictly on the principles of equality, independence, interdependence, mutual respect for national interests and the interests of humanity. Friends, we are having this dialogue in the context of the 100 years of the founding of the Communist Party of China. These 100 years have been absolutely remarkable in world history. There is absolutely no precedent parallel of any country that has transformed itself so much in such a short time to set an example in some ways to the rest of the world. And this transformation is taking place at a time when the West is declining, and some of the earlier speakers mentioned not just declining, but collapse. I don't know whether we are anywhere close to that moment, but it just goes to underline the fact that our world is today on the brink of a major transformation. Asia is rising, The rest of the world is also rising at its own pace, but the West is declining. In my view, this contrast should not be celebrated. It should make us introspect. And this transformation should not lead to any kind of confrontation between China and the United States. Since ours is some kind of an international audience, we should promote the idea that this transformation should also take place peacefully for the good of humanity. Otherwise, any confrontation between these two, one declining superpower, one rising superpower, will be catastrophic for the world. I would like to share some views on why India-China relationship, why India-China friendship and cooperation is not just necessary, but absolutely critical for South Asia, where I live and many of you come from. What is of great concern to all of us is tension between India and China on the one hand, but also unending hostility between India and Pakistan. And those of you who know the current atmosphere in India, both China and Pakistan are projected as our enemies, making it extremely difficult for anyone who advocates friendship and cooperation either with China or with Pakistan. However, if we understand the situation properly, we would know there is absolutely no way for South Asia to rise to its full potential without India-Pakistan normalization and without a comprehensive improvement in relations between India and China. In fact, India, China, Pakistan cooperation, this three-nation cooperation is critical for the future, for the destiny of South Asia, which is the most populous region in the world with a combined population of more than 1.8 billion. It is also the region where the largest number of poor people live. If we take the poor people in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Afghanistan together, South Asia, which is the cradle of so many great religions, unfortunately today is also home to the largest number of poor people. It is also the least integrated region in the world. Many of our friends outside India and outside Pakistan may not know how low is the level of integration. All this simply cannot be changed without India-China relationship becoming normal and India-Pakistan relationship becoming peaceful and harmonious. Now, how can this be achieved? In my view, friends, one way, it's not the only way, but one way where cooperation is possible and cooperation can lead to trust and cooperation can lead to solving some of the problems is by India joining the Belt and Road Initiative. There's a lot of misconception in India about the Belt and Road Initiative. In 2017, at the inaugural summit of the Belt and Road conference in Beijing, India boycotted. I was a non-official participant, and I realized that the Belt and Road Initiative, far from being a challenge to India, a problem to India, can be a potential solution to the many problems that we face. How? Some of you know that a very important project under the Belt and Road Initiative is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, which connects Kashgar in Western China to Gwadar in Balochistan in Pakistan. 3,000 kilometers of a network of highways, railways, energy networks, and other projects. It's certainly going to change Pakistan's economy, Pakistan's development very positively. It's already happening. I've seen it. Now, India views this project with great suspicion and actually sees this as yet another example of how China and Pakistan are somehow ganging up against India and threatening our security and our territorial integrity. This is based on wrong understanding of the Belt and Road Initiative and also a wrong understanding of our own geography. The argument given by India, for the Indian government, I mean, for opposing the China-Pakistan economic corridor is that it passes through what we in India call Pakistan occupied Kashmir, POK, a part of Kashmir which is now under control and possession of Pakistan. And therefore, the Indian government thinks that this is a threat and it's a violation of our national sovereignty. This argument is hollow because there is no way whatsoever that the part of Kashmir that is with Pakistan today can ever become part of India. History cannot be rolled back. Just as the part of Kashmir that is with India can never go back to Pakistan, nor can it become independent. The only way India can solve the Kashmir issue is through dialogue with Pakistan and a new concept of bringing the two sides of Kashmir together. Now, bringing the two sides of Kashmir together is what the Belt and Road Initiative can do, what the China-Pakistan economic corridor can do. How? If India joins the China-Pakistan economic corridor, then we can bring that corridor from the Pakistan side of Kashmir into the Indian side of Kashmir and further down to Delhi and the rest of India, so that India gets connected not only with the other side of Kashmir, not only with Pakistan, not only with the Western China, but also the Central Asian republics. I mean, it's a grand vision. That is a vision of President Xi Jinping. Furthermore, friends, if India joins the China-Pakistan corridor, we can get, that is, India can get a land access to Afghanistan. This will lead to a common development of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and further to the rest of countries in West Asia, Central Asia. Furthermore, we can connect the extended China-Pakistan economic corridor, by which I mean India joining the CPEC. We can connect that with yet another ambitious corridor in the east. That is the BCIM, Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar, which connects Kunming in eastern China with Kolkata. Now imagine, friends, and our good friend Ravi Bhuthalingam has done remarkable work to promote this idea of BCIM. Now imagine, friends, those of you who are familiar with the map of South Asia, if we can connect BCIM all the way from Kunming to Kolkata with the China-Pakistan economic corridor, it means that we have a garland of connectivity right from eastern China, Kunming to Kolkata to Kabul. Now this connectivity can transform the economy and development of whole of South Asia, integrate this region the way Europe has got integrated today. So this integration will bring economic growth, social development, more important, security for all the countries, because interdependence brings security and peace. So one of the points that I would like to mention in the context of how India and China can come together, of course, for their own good, but for the good of the whole of South Asia, is by creatively joining, partnering in the Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, for this to happen, I have been telling my Chinese friends that the Belt and Road Initiative should not remain a China-controlled, China-led initiative, which today it is. It must become more broad-based. It must become more democratic. It must become truly participative, so that other countries can feel that they're not subservient to China, but they're partnering with China and other countries on a base of equality. Now here again,
I just wanted to let you know that your presentation has reached about 35 minutes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'll just conclude in just 1 minute.
Okay.
I'll just conclude in 1 minute. And that is that we in India must think long-term. We must think civilizationally. And this is a point, when Professor Jacques mentioned that both our countries are civilizational nations and civilizational states, it means that India is not just India after 1947. It is the civilizational India. And this civilizational India must once again begin to interact with civilizational China to create a new South Asia, a better South Asia, a new Asia, and a better Asia, but furthermore, a new world and a better world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sudheendra ji, and also Professor Jacques, for two very insightful and timely presentations for today. We have many comments and questions from our audience. And so we're going to enter a discussion now, so people can continue to ask questions as we discuss with Professor Jacques and Sudheendra ji. I think first we had a question from Archishman Raju.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank both of the panelists again. Professor Jacques, we've been talking on email, but it's a pleasure to see you on Zoom and hear you, and Sudheendra ji also. And I wanted to bring in, because many people, even while organizing these events, this question has been raised of why bring in the West when you're talking about India and China. And I think that it is essential to talk about the role of the West in hampering friendly and cooperative relations between India and China. And actually this term, the collapse of the West, we took from this book by W.E.B. Du Bois called The World and Africa. His first chapter is titled The Collapse of Europe, which is being written in the Second World War, at the end of the Second World War. And we wanted to make that kind of a comparison, as Professor Jacques pointed out, with this drastic change from people, from being the end of history to suddenly a very different time period that we are living in, a moment of flux. So this is what we wanted to convey. But I just wanted to ask what both of the panelists, what they see as the role of the West and the future of the West, and of course, both in terms of things like the AUKUS and recent comments on Taiwan. Whether they see, I guess I'll just stop it there. What they see as the role of the West in this relationship, but also in the future with regard to China.
Shall I say something? Well, it was very good to see you. It's better to see you than to be emailing each other. And thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I think that there's two influences that the West has on India, which complicate the problem a lot. I think the first is that I think that British colonialism was much more damaging for India than the multiple forms of colonial repression that China experienced. And I think that the big problem is that it left India, or has left India, in some measure with a conflicted sense of identity. That it's to some extent it is, you know, the view of Indians, or at least some Indians, maybe quite a large proportion of Indians, still in some degree or other looks to Britain or looks to the West as a consequence. Now, what the reasons for that are, I think need, you know, I know it's been discussed a lot, but it is very important, I think. The Chinese have never really had that problem. The Chinese have always known who they are. They don't have any conflicted sense of identity. They have a very strong identity of what they are as Chinese, and they were not, that did not compromise China. So, you know, the argument often is, you know, well, India can benefit from its relationship with the West more than China can benefit, and so on. I don't think this is true. I think the fact that the Chinese have a very strong sense of themselves and a very independent cultural identity is a real strength in China. And I think that for the Indians, I think it's a big problem that still in some degree or other, they look to the history of colonialism and look to the West as some kind of guide or some kind of semi-emotional home and so on. And that is just not true of China. And I think, you know, and this has enabled China to get on with it in a way that India has found it much more difficult to get on with it over the recent decades. I think this is really important. And, you know, in the Western view, the British view, you know, you often hear people saying, well, you know, India's great advantage, you know, is that it can draw from the legacy of its relationship with Britain, blah, 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 you know. And I say, no, the opposite is true. One of India's biggest handicaps is the fact that, you know, it's compromised, beguiled in some degree or other by that history. I mean, India's not the only country that has this problem, but there's a real stark contrast between, it seems to me, China and India. The second problem, which is obviously intimately related to that, is the way in which America's played the relationship. I think this is a particularly American question. America's played the relationship with India, and it's difficult to know to what extent and how, but clearly for some time now, since Clinton, the United States has sought to develop a relationship with India. It started really on the nuclear question, and in varying degrees, it's carried on since. And and of course, it takes various forms. I mean, the fact that a lot of Indians, by the way, a lot of Chinese too, but a lot of Indians work in Silicon Valley. And, you know, when Modi spoke, there were in America, there were a very large number of Indians present and so on. And I think that a lot of, so I think there's an element of seduction and an element of attraction, you know, possibility in the relationship between China and between India and the United States. And the most recent expression in a more pronounced form, of course, is India joining the Quad with the US Australia and Japan. And I think that is unfortunate because it's obviously part, I mean, the Quad is part of the American, containment strategy vis-a-vis China. So I think that these things have made it, have sort of drawn India closer in a way that in a much earlier period of history, the non-alignment period and so on, when India was strongly neutral, and if anything, in certain respects, leaned towards the Soviet Union. Now that's been replaced, it seems to me, in the latter period by a sort of Indian leaning towards the United States. And I do think that has had effect on the Indian body politic and the relationship between those two countries. Now, how far it's gone, I would defer to you to give a view about that, and how far it's gone down that road, and to what extent what we are all hoping for, which is a closer relationship between China and India, is in some degree made more difficult, certainly made more difficult. That's, I think, clear, made more difficult. To what extent it's a kind of blockage, I don't know.
Yep, Sudheendra ji.
Yeah. May I bring a different perspective to this question? You asked why should we bring in the West in a discussion on India-China relations? If we look at the evolution of the two civilizations, we will see that both India and China have been impacted by the Western civilization. Negatively in some respects, but also positively. We are not immune to how the West has influenced us, even though the West colonized us and subjugated us in the previous centuries. But human history does not proceed in a linear way, and therefore, even though we are against Western domination, economic, political, military domination, and must strive for an equitable world, we should not be blind to the positive side of the Western civilization. No civilization is perfect. No civilization is superior. In fact, these are in fact words of President Xi Jinping himself. In 2019, he hosted a conference for dialogue among Asian civilizations, which I attended. And he said that no civilization is perfect, no civilization is superior, and no civilization has been immune to mutual learning. And therefore, I would submit that in the India-China conversation, how we can improve our relations as two great Asian nations and the only two countries with a population of more than 1 billion, we should befriend the West and other parts of the world in such a way that we together create what is called a community of shared destiny for humanity. I agree with Professor Jacques that India is making a big mistake by allying with the United States in a strategy to contain China, the so-called quadrilateral, and the so-called Indo-Pacific region, which is sought to be made exclusive for the Quad countries. and it has legitimately, understandably created concerns for the Chinese and has created a big impediment in improving India-China relations. At the same time, I would also like to introduce one more thought here, that the Chinese, because as he mentioned, they have evolved more or less on their own with a very strong identity. There is a perception among the neighbors of China and also other countries around the world that China is too powerful and too much of China. And that is not good for either China and for the rest of the world. So China also has to make a lot of efforts to remove the apprehensions. Some of them may be imaginary, some of them may be real. The apprehensions of people in India and other countries that China is not going to dominate Asia or the world.
Our next question is kind of related to what you two just talked about in terms of identity, also differences, similarities with India and China. Our next question from Nandita Chaturvedi asks for both panelists to elaborate on the concept of the civilizational state. And I think this is also referring to something you said, Professor Jacques, earlier about distinctly different, but also parallel, some parallel similarities between India and China, especially with respect to India. What differentiates India from a Western liberal democracy?
This is a difficult question. Well, I'm going to say a few words about it, and I'm going to hope that in the big holes I leave, Sudheendra can sort me out. I think that look, my simple way of looking at China as a civilization state is that China only became a nation state. There's no date you can fix to it, but in the late 19th century. And the reason that it was obliged to think of itself as a nation state is that by this moment, basically the tributary system was dead, and China was divided, invaded. It was in a position of great weakness, and so it had to begin to take on the norms of being a nation state. But if you look at Chinese history, obviously, the last 100-odd years is a very short period in Chinese history. I mean, and I think this is very important when we're looking at China and India. One thing that's really extraordinary about China is the line of continuity over a period of something like 2,000 years, ever since 211 BC and the victory of the Qin dynasty. It is amazing. I mean, Fukuyama makes, I think, a very good point in one of his books on political order. He says that there is no country in the world that displays the same continuity regarding its governance as China, and that is, I think, absolutely true. That if you look at the continuity runs through the imperial dynasties to present-day China, and so present Chinese governance is absolutely recognizable through this historical prism. And so the fact that China's been a nation state for the last 100-odd years is a relative, it's the sort of, it's the upper soil of the ecology, if you like. The many layers that have formed China are civilizational. And so if you want to look at, what do we think defines being Chinese as? Well, let's think about it. Obviously, Confucian values are very important. Very distinctive relationship between the state and society. That's why India could never have that same relationship, by the way, because it goes back, it's so deeply buried in history. So it's not that India can't learn things, and I think it should learn certain things from from the Chinese state. It can never be the same. I mean, it would just be defying the historical tradition and continuity. Very distinctive notion of the family. The importance of Guanxi as a way in which for the norms and values of society and the way society is structured. I mean, for that matter, language, I mean, the fact that China enjoys well, it has many languages, but with a common written script for a very, very long period of time. Chinese food, chopsticks. I mean, all these things are very, very important to being Chinese, and they're very old. And they are much more important. The legacy of this is much more important, in my view, than the period of being a nation state. So the two exist in alongside each other, with one, I think, primary and the other secondary. And sometimes they exist in some form of conflict. So, if you see a language conflict in China, for example, in Mongolia, about education and so on, I think that's still, those kind of questions in China in a contemporary way are being fought out between the civilizational values and the nation state values. One other thing to add to this is that really what produced, the most important expression of the nation state mentality in China is the emphasis on sovereignty, which is a consequence of the century of humiliation. That is really the most important single thing which defines this, is important in terms of China's sense of being a nation state. I can't remember, I got so carried away there that I can't remember what else I was supposed to say, but I'm sure someone's going to rescue me here. I mean, it seems to me that India is very different, but I'd like to hear Sudheendra's points about this, because maybe we can go into a bit of a dialogue about it. Briefly, of course. Emily.
Yep, Sudheendra ji, feel free to also come in here. The question was, what differentiates India from a Western liberal democracy?
Yeah, it's a good question.
But I would like to make a few comments on how India and China are both civilizational states, but different kinds of civilizational states, and why we have to show a certain example of going beyond the era of Westphalian nation states. Because we are today nation states, let's admit, of a Western kind. Today, all countries in the world, all non-Western countries in the world, including China and India, are nation states of a Western kind, of a Westphalian kind. Now, this was in some way imposed on us. We did not consciously choose this because we were not free to choose our destinies at that time. But with the decline of the West and with the rise of Asia, with the rise of China and India, in the coming decades and coming centuries, especially because of globalization, the nature of the nation state is going to change, and both India and China can and should make a great contribution to transforming the concept of a nation state, which is more cooperative, more inclusive, less exclusive. Now here, I would like to submit that in one way in which we are different from China is that we are more assimilative. And this is our strength. We are more diverse. This is our strength. Professor Jacques mentioned language. There is a certain linguistic uniformity in China. But look at India. We are a nation of dozens of languages. And yet, we are one. We have far greater religious diversity in India than in China. I know I'm not saying this in a sense of being superior, not at all. We are different. And we want to, we can only be different and we can only evolve in this manner with our diversity contributing to our unity. It's not easy, and we all know the kind of problems that we are facing today. But if we dig deep into our civilization, it teaches us to respect all influences, all religions, all faiths, all cultures, and assimilate them into a harmonious entity. And in this sense, as the world comes together, I think India can make a very unique contribution to the rest of the world to live with diversity and yet move in the direction of unity. Now, there's a question of liberal democracy. Now, even democracy is something that we have in the way it operates in India now, as a parliamentary democracy, is something new. It did not exist before. That does not mean that democratic traditions, democratic customs, ethos did not exist in India. Now, India therefore has to make our democracy more mature, more truly democratic by reforming our systems, our institutions with the wisdom of the past, which we haven't done adequately so far. There is too much of influence of the Western institutions on us yet, but we have to move. I think the very fact that the West is going to decline, and it was mentioned how the American democracy is in a deep sense of crisis. All this will make India introspect and reform itself and bring more Indianness into our democracy. And lastly, I believe that this will also have a certain impact on China itself, because even China has to democratize itself. It cannot remain exactly the way it is today. And I want to go back to this talk that Ravi Bhuthalingam gave at the Observer Research Foundation 10 years ago, and I would like to share it with all of you later. He mentioned how China will move in the direction of Confucian democracy. There is already a certain disillusionment, not explicitly stated by the Communist Party of China, disillusionment with Marxism-Leninism. Communism in its classical sense is not inspiring the Chinese society. Chinese society is also trying to rediscover the wisdom of the past. And as it does so, it will rediscover the wisdom of Confucianism and other strands of its civilization, and it will create its own unique system of democracy as we move forward.
Yeah, go ahead, Professor Jacques, and then we'll move on to a group of
I found that very interesting and helpful. I agree with really what you're trying to argue. I just want to add one thing in relationship to this subject, and that is what civilization states bring to the world. Now, we've lived since 1649 and the Peace of Westphalia in a world which started off essentially in a European phenomenon, became universal. To be recognized today, you have to be a nation state. And I think that China and India fit uncomfortably into that model. And I don't think it's just China and India. I think that wherever you look, there are countries which have, in varying degrees, a very strong sense of civilizational legacy. And so I think the decline of the West will probably bring with it a phenomenon, which is the decline of the nation state as in the European manner, as a concept of a polity. The problem with the nation state is, in many ways, it's been a very divisive phenomenon. I mean, the rise of the nation state in the 19th century, and Wang Hui is very good on this, by the way, the Chinese scholar, that the nation state required or allowed and demanded a dominant ethnic group. And that's exactly what happened across Europe. And in varying degrees, of course, it's also been true in the latter day Western countries like the United States, Australia, and so on. Now, civilization states are, and China and India in this context are exemplars, are much more diverse and ethnically diverse. And China has never really, apart from the problems they have in the Western regions with the Uyghur and the Tibet, China has never prioritized ethnicity. It goes back to Confucius. Actually, the key measure for the Chinese was culture, not ethnicity. So this is a very different tradition. And so these societies, India and China, in their varying ways, are much more mixed, much more diverse, and much more inclusive in, not in every sense, of course, we know that, but tend to a greater inclusion than is true of the nation state. So I think it's not just a question of comparing the two, but what do civilization states bring to the world as we come to the end of the dominance of the West and its particular form of organization, the nation state, and what might happen subsequently and what China and India will bring to that.
One short addition to this particular discussion. Professor Jacques mentioned that sovereignty, the idea of sovereignty is very deep in the Chinese concept of civilizational state. I think that going forward, the idea of sovereignty has to be made more flexible. The world has to move in the direction of shared sovereignty and even multiple sovereignties. Exclusive sovereignty is an impediment to the idea of human fraternity and human family. Now let's look at our own region, South Asia. Can the problem of Kashmir be resolved peacefully with the idea of exclusive sovereignty between India and Pakistan? No. Anyone who knows the history of our India, Pakistan, or even Kashmir, we have to accept shared sovereignty as the way forward for resolving the Kashmir issue. Similarly, even the border issue between India and China, I mean, something that was imposed by the British on us, are we to take it as the final line of sovereignty between our two countries forever? We have to be flexible. You know, whether it's Tibet or Xinjiang, the idea of shared sovereignty is not a challenge to sovereignty. Rather, shared sovereignty, multiple sovereignty is taking the idea of civilizational state forward in the 21st century and beyond.
There's actually another model there's another aspect to this, which is in the Chinese view. Deng Xiaoping first proposed the idea for Hong Kong, which hasn't worked out so well, but that's another matter. But of one country, two systems. And his proposal to deal with the problem of the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands with dispute with Japan was to put the matter of sovereignty on one side and engage in joint development. And I think this is going to be very important, not just in the South China Sea in the long run for some kind of solution, but I also think it's going to be manifest in the Belt and Road Initiative, that these kind of questions, which have been, had such strong lines of division between them, are going to be, those lines are going to be to some degree erased with either in the suggestion you make in relation to sovereignty or the Chinese way of let's engage in joint development and let's leave the question of sovereignty on one side. That is for the future.
Just because I have my eye on the time, unsurprisingly, this conversation has become very interesting, and I wanted to ask for the speaker's permission to extend our program and discussion a little bit, if it's okay with the two of you, just because we have many questions for you. Is that okay, Professor Jacques?
Well, it's not an indefinite postponement, is it? I'm not going to be here till midnight.
No. I was thinking maybe 15 to 20 minutes. Just we have many comments, and I'd also like to also ask some of the people who are part of the supporting organizations to also come in a little later, but just 15 to 20 minutes, if that's okay.
Yeah, all right.
Our next group of questions is actually from many commenters who are interested in what both of our panelists have talked about in terms of the statement, India has a lot to learn from China and China has a lot to learn from India. And I'm gonna try to combine them together so you two can answer them all together. So in regards to what China can learn from India, C.K. Raju talks about a non-Western calculus to get ahead in the technology race, which is worrying California today, but there are no channels of communication. So there's a question of what exactly do our panelists think of what China can learn from India today? And we also have a comment from Shantanu Ghosh, who's interested in the other side, which is what can India learn from China? And he wonders, can India actually learn anything from China's state-controlled political structure? Or is it just not possible for a country as diverse as India to adopt such policies? Which is also related to the very interesting dialogue we just had about the differences, similarities between India, China, and also the Western liberal democracy.
All right.
Maybe Professor Jacques, you can start us off with our string of comments.
Should I explain my question a bit? Give me a minute.
Yeah.
I think we have been talking for rather a long time about problems that are virtually insolvable. You know, if we keep talking of Tibet, I come from the era when they used to say Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai before they started saying Hindi Chini Bye Bye, right? So I think that instead of those difficult problems, let's move on to something different. And that's why I'm talking about this issue. As you know, the California State Education Board has transformed the school syllabus, particularly with regard to calculus, cancelling the calculus, because data science and AI is what they are looking for. And they feel that calculus is not needed there, which is of course something completely wrong. Now, this is what I'm trying to explain, and this discussion has been going on in Africa and so on. People are interested in racism. The existing theory of the calculus that Newton discovered it, and it's all nonsense. And it's complete nonsense. Newton didn't even understand it properly. And that's why it is so difficult that the California State Board has to change it. Now, this decolonization process been tried out in some countries like Malaysia, it's been tried out in Iran, and it's been tried out even in Palestine and so on. But it has been tried out in India, a few universities, Ambedkar University and so on, but it is not taking off. Now, why doesn't China look at it? Why do they want to have a colonial system of education? I agree that India was badly affected, but so is China. Why can't they learn something on this and try out? Because the Indians may not be able to do it, even if it started from India, but Chinese may be able to do it. They are able to think for themselves and get out of the mantle of the West.
Well, I'm afraid I'm out of my depth in trying to respond to that. I listen to you with interest, but I don't know enough about what your example to really say anything useful.
Sense of communication. There are no channels of communication. I can write an article and I can communicate with people in California, but I cannot communicate with people in China. How do I do that? They're just not there.
Well, there are plenty of ways you could do it. I mean, you know, the Chinese are online more than any other country in the world, and you could communicate with. You couldn't communicate them with WhatsApp, but you could do it with WeChat, and you can send documents and so on between each other, and you can have a dialogue in that manner. And the Chinese are very interested. I mean, I'm not talking about the Chinese in. You know, I find the Chinese really interested in having that kind of dialogue.
Yeah, I think the questions related to connected to this was more about expanding on what India can learn from China and China from India today. And I think especially the question that Shantanu asked about, is it not possible for a country as diverse as India to adopt such policies or basically learn from China?
I think that, I mean, one of the problems of mutual learning is that well, is there a desire both ways to learn from each other? And I think that is, to be honest with you, I think it's limited. I think that, you know, someone else said earlier on, I can't remember who it was, but you know, there was a lot of you know, doubt and hostility, which has got worse towards China and so on. And so, I mean, first of all, there has to be a desire. And let me add to that another problem, which I observe when I'm in the big cities of China, and that is, I see very few Indians. So I think that you know, there's a lot of East Asians, very large number of East Asians, say at the major Chinese universities, but there are very few Indians, and that's always, I've always noted that and been rather, you know, kind of upset about it, because, you know, the two countries have I know it's a difficult border, but it's a big border, and they're not, you know, a million miles away from each other. So why so few? And I think that there's a sort of lack of, you know, there are people who are very interested in a dialogue, both in China and in India with each other. But I don't think there's a critical mass who are in favor, or, I mean, Ravi Bhusaligan would probably talk about this much better than I would, because, you know, he knows China very well, but also he knows India, you know, obviously intimately. But I think that is a problem. That's a limit. It may well be on, I mean, on the Chinese side, what do I think the attitude of the Chinese is towards Indians? I think, look, I'm going to be absolutely brutally honest about this. And that is, I think there's a tendency for China to look down on India. I do think that is a problem. I don't know the extent of it, but that's my feeling. The lack of curiosity is maybe because it doesn't think it can learn that much from India. I think they're wrong, but I think that is a problem. And on the Indian side, I think that this sort of, you know, the cliches and prejudices about towards China in terms of, for example, governance, you know, that which are largely Western style cliches, you know, coming from the US and so on. I mean, you know, it's an authoritarian society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that is also, that's extremely simplistic, because actually I don't think, you know, I don't think that, to be frank about it, I don't think China is at all interested in changing the political system of any other country in the world. It's just not what China does. It's never done it. In the tributary system period, it did not do that. It did not, a condition of a change of government was not Chinese agreement. It was never like that. The Chinese are very, very, permissive. The reason is because I think they're very self-confident about their own system and their own governing system. And this is the middle kingdom mentality, if you like. So, how can other countries be like us? We've had a history of 2,000 years of civilization. I think that is part of it. And I think this is therefore a big misunderstanding on the part of not just Indians, but this is a widespread problem that, when China's strong enough, it's going to just come in and we'll have a political system like theirs. No. In a month of Sundays, that is never going to happen. This is a completely misleading and aberrant view. That is not what China will be like. China will be very different, by the way, in this context to the United States. I don't think we should see the arrival of China on the global scene as, we'll go into a new phase with China being the great hegemon. Don't think it's going to work like that. That's too simplistic. It's not finding out and inquiring about how the Chinese think, what the Chinese ideas are, how Chinese history has worked. It's going to be very difficult. That's why explaining it is very difficult, because you've got to get into the Chinese mind, the Chinese history, to the Chinese tradition in order to be able to understand this.
Sudheendra ji, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I would like to, very briefly mention one thing that India must learn from China and what China should learn from India. One aspect that has not come into our discussion, but of extreme importance to India, which was of course there in the mission statement, is the success of China in eliminating extreme poverty. It's more than any other accomplishment of China. It's the fact that nearly 800 million people were lifted out of poverty in just 4 decades, making a big dent in global poverty. This is a lesson for all the developing countries and a big lesson for India, where we are still grappling with the issue of poverty, even though poverty levels in India also have come down. It's way back in 1969 that our former Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, gave a slogan of Garibi Hatao, a very popular slogan. Garibi Hatao means remove poverty. China has succeeded and India is yet to succeed. And this is where a very strong leadership with personal commitment and institutional commitment makes a big difference. I am most impressed by Xi Jinping's personal commitment to the goal of making China free of poverty. YouTube is full of videos of his visits to poor areas, remote areas of China. He has made more than 80 trips to these places to personally monitor the anti-poverty programs of the government. Now, in contrast, I ask myself as an Indian, how many places has my Prime Minister visited to see the condition of poor places and give personal leadership to making India succeed in Garibi Hatao? I think this is a very big lesson that India should learn, and we cannot give the excuse that China is a one-party dictatorship, we are a democracy, we can't do the same thing. It's just an excuse. What China should learn from India? It is indeed a matter of concern, and Professor Jacques mentioned that there is a certain looking down upon China in a section of Chinese society, not all. They think that they have become rich so soon and now they are competing with China. India doesn't matter. Now, this mentality is not going to be good for China. China has, in a material sense, has progressed too fast, too much, and that has its own consequences. And there is a certain moral vacuum that has developed in Chinese society. And it is, I think, necessary for China to understand why, in spite of economic poverty in India, which cannot be excused, but in spite of this, there is a certain, there's a different way of looking at life. And that comes from our spiritual traditions. I'm not excusing, not at all, poverty in India, but there is something to be learned about how human societies, and especially those who are deprived of the basic necessities of life, still have a very strong commitment to values of life. They have not given up values of life. In fact, they are more, in many ways, they are more ethical, more spiritual than people who have become rich in India. And therefore, China should study the spiritual traditions of India more seriously.
Our next questions have to do with anti-communism and also the impact of Western ideology in anti-communism and its role in hostility towards China. G.N. Nagaraj comments that there is an association of democracies vis-a-vis communist ideology and the fear of Indian rulers of being wiped away by communist ideology that also has to be discussed. Purba also says that there is a linkage between anti-communism that underlies hostility towards a rise in China that is racist and has origins and is the basis of Western imperialism. I want to give Professor Jacques and Sudheendra a chance to respond to those. But before I do that, I also want to invite two specific people to also comment. First is Dr. Anthony Montero of the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Liberation, which is one of the organizations which has been supporting this event series. So first, Dr. Montero, would you like to comment?
Well, I don't have a great deal to add. I mean, I'm just thrilled with this conversation. But I do think that the question of the legacy of anti-communism and the racism of imperialism in Asia and Africa, I don't think we can leave out of the equation. I mean, whether it's at the conscious level, the ideological level, or even the unconscious level of the infiltration of Western values. And when we say Western values, I would say in their form of the last 200 years, we're talking about imperialist and colonial values and racist values. So I think Purba's question is right on target. You know, it's not authoritarianism and it's not democracy. It's Western hegemony based in anti-communism, and we are still living out the legacy of the West's reaction to the October Revolution and the Chinese revolutions, and the threat that each pose to the colonial and imperial systems in Asia and Africa. I think the question is right on target. We cannot rule it out. Just one last small thing. I agree very much with the way Professor Jacques began, because you can't talk about what's going on in Asia unless you talk about the US scramble, not for Africa, but the scramble to divide Asia. And I'm just so, how could you say, it's so disappointing when Asians join with the former colonizer to further partition and divide Asians. The same thing in Africa. Africa's self-partitioning at this point. And this is done in the name of democracy. And a democracy, ironically, that the elites in the United States do not feel that they can hold on to, but Asians are saying that American democracy is what we want. And the American elites are saying it's not working for us. And I'm not going to even talk about the American people who have lost faith in our democracy. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for asking me.
Thank you, Dr. Matera. I would also now like to invite Raviji to provide a quick comment or remarks if you'd like to.
For whom?
Raviji?
Ravi Bhutalingam ji, if you would
Okay.
like to, because you've been mentioned a few times, maybe.
Right, thank you.
Yes.
First of all, thank you very much, Sudheendra and Martin, for brilliant presentations, and thank you for mentioning my name so generously at, on several occasions. I can only say that this has been a very, very rich dialogue and a rich conversation, and I have really both enjoyed and benefited from it, listening to every word. So there is very little I can add, but I'll just make one point which I think highlights where India and China are positioned today in relation to each other. I think there are 4 dimensions to this which India and China have not reconciled and need to reconcile both across these dimensions and within. At the lowest level is the boundary question, which goes back to a sense of sovereignty. I think Martin spoke about it. Westphalian sovereignty, which says up to a certain line you have 100% sovereignty, and beyond that you have 0, and the other side similarly has 0 on this side, and then comes the line and they have 100, which was historically over centuries not the case in human history ever. At the next level, beyond this sovereignty borderline issue, I think there is a question of identities of India and China in their self-image, in how they regard themselves, whether they regard themselves as civilizations or as modern states or a mix of the two or whatever. I think there is a lot of stuff going on there which needs to be sorted out. At the third level, I think is the issue of the economic disparity between the two countries, which also leads to a phenomenon which has been mentioned in this talk, which is that China seems to matter more to India than India matters to China. And that is probably an outcome of this huge economic disparity of China being 5 times, now 6 times the economy of India, and likewise per capita GDP as well. And the fourth dimension, which is, ironically, it's something we're living through. It's an existential dimension, which is we are going through a pandemic. The COP is happening in Glasgow, talking about climate change. We are in a digital world. All these 3, climate change, pandemics, digitalization, do not pay any attention to borders, any attention to identity. but they are all existential. If we lose the battle against climate change or a pandemic, the planet as a human habitat is gone. So I think we are caught between these items, numbers 1 and 4. 1, a narrow view of sovereignty. That's where we are focusing our attention. But the real danger is item number 4, which is going to make mincemeat of humanity in some decades. And if India and China, constituting 40% of the population, cannot get their hands around it, it's very difficult to see how this is going to happen. So this is going to mean negotiation along these 4 axes at the same time. Somebody mentioned it very well. I think it was Sudheendra or maybe Martin, saying first be good neighbors, then be good neighbors who conduct business with each other but still compete, then be good neighbors who can collaborate, and finally be people who can see the broader global vision. Now, can these two civilizational states, civilizational identities, India and China, rise to this? I personally am not too sure at this moment, but this is how I see the problem emerging. And let me stop there because I don't want to take up more time. And thank you once again for inviting.
Thank you, Raviji.
Wonderful discussion.
I agree with Raviji that this was a very rich discussion, as seen by all the comments. I would like to invite Professor Jacques to give some final remarks, and then Sudheendra ji before we end the panel.
I remember that when I did a speaking tour of India, which partly Ravi, my good friend, helped to organize. And I remember after one of the talks in the newspaper the following day, I can't remember which newspaper it was, it said something like, you know, the return of the civilization state or the importance of the civilization state. And I remember saying to anyone who would listen that it would be inconceivable for any Western, or certainly English language, but I suspect Western newspaper to carry such a headline, because the whole idea was fundamentally incomprehensible. Because really the West doesn't operate with a concept of civilization, apart from very occasionally, and it always dates back to Greece and Rome, which of course, you know, there's no strong connection with in the Western mind, because they are not just far away, but they belong to 2 different countries, to Greece and Rome. And I think that one of the things I've really enjoyed about this discussion today, and thank you again for inviting me, and I've really enjoyed it. I've enjoyed the contributions. I very much enjoyed the dialogue I've had with Sudheendra, because I think it's been very, you know, open-ended and flowing. Is that the question of civilization states is a subject for a lot more dialogue. And I wonder, when we're talking about the relationship between China and India, whether this can't be pursued in a more systematic way, a dialogue between Chinese and Indian scholars about this, because I think it would be very productive. Because instead of starting off with differences, you start off with a pretty broad canvas where there are lots of interconnections, and I would welcome that, and also the possibility of making then strategic interventions in a global debate by Chinese and Indian scholars who, if not saying the same thing, will certainly be on the same wavelength in relationship to this. I think this would be very valuable. The last. I'm not going to waffle on. The other point I'm going to make is just to respond to my good friend Ravi. Very interesting thoughts, I think, on you know, the great existential questions, know no borders. And that, I think, is going to be a very important thought for us, reality for us, when we're looking forward to the next, half a century, when, American hegemony will have basically have come to an end. It'll still be an important country, but it'll no longer be an American world system. And we'll be looking at a different kind of way of organizing the world. I'm not saying in 50 years it will be all done and dusted. It'll probably take much longer than that. But these kind of questions, they defy a nation state or an international bifurcation. They don't lend themselves to that because the problem is beyond Westphalia. And maybe that would be, a good title for a discussion that your next discussion could be beyond Westphalia or something like that, which this has been very creative dimension to the discussion. And I think it would be don't let it go. You've done a great job. Thank you very much to the organizers. And thank you for asking me. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, Professor Jacques. Sudheendra ji? Oh, you're muted.
I'll only add to what Professor Jacques said by way of saying that this has been a very educative discussion for me, and I have benefited from his thoughts and also the comments made by other participants. I want to thank the organizers, Nandita, Emily, all others for this. A very positive contribution to India-China dialogue in the year of 100 years of CPC. My last comment is addressing a very important point that Raviji mentioned, the existential dimension of India-China relationship. It doesn't concern only the two countries, it concerns all the countries, the entire humanity. The environmental destruction, the pandemic, and the way the digital era is evolving. What it tells us is that the world, including India and China, must move beyond nationalism towards internationalism. Second thing, that we must give less importance to economism and militarism, and more importance to fundamental, universal, eternal values that are rooted in our civilizations and all the other civilizations of the world. Now, in this context, the one slogan or thought that President Xi Jinping has advanced, that's building a community of shared destiny for humankind, it's a very profound thought. And I can't think of any other world leader who is advancing a thought like this. However, it hasn't really inspired the rest of the global community to the extent that it should. And there's a need for China to introspect on why this is so. And it's my fervent desire that China resolves the problems it has with some neighbors, including India, in a manner that is away from militarism and away from any perception of domination. It's also my desire, and I'm sure that is desire of all of us, that this idea of building a community of shared destiny for mankind will sound true, genuine, if China resolves the problem with Taiwan peacefully. Of course, given an opportunity or option, of Chinese would definitely want to do it peacefully, but there is an external angle that the United States, the West, and hence it is of utmost importance, as I mentioned earlier, that there should be a democratic pressure on American government, on other Western countries, that they should not see China as a threat, and therefore do all this manipulation to contain China, draw India into this anti-China alliance. All this is going to create more and more problems for mankind. All of us have to make some self-correction, but China also has to make some self-correction. Thank you very much for this wonderful, highly educative dialogue.
Thank you to both of you, and I will now hand it over to our Chishman.
Thank you very much. And I know it has gone over time, for which I apologize. But I think we raised a lot of interesting questions today on the civilization state, really on a future without Western hegemony and what it could look like, on the parallel but distinct nature of the Indian and Chinese situations. And I hope we can continue this conversation in the future. So thanks a lot, and thank you for staying for this whole time.
You know,